I actually think the main benefit was the way in which the MDGs became a matter of public policy in most of the developing world, completely unanticipated. I mean, when you pass Millennium Development Goals in a General Assembly of the United Nations, you assume it's another set of aspirations which no one will honor. And that's not merely a cynical comment, it's an astute comment based on past experience. Most countries simply deride or ignore the so-called goals that the UN sets. Indeed, they ignore most of the conventions which they have ratified. So in this instance, to see the Millennium Development Goals suddenly become an intense matter of public policy and public debate in one country after another seemed to me to be the most auspicious and most fascinating of the realities around the Millennium Development Goals. Frankly, the resource mobilization part of it is pretty equivocal. And the actual achievement of the goals varies dramatically. The goal of the reduction of poverty, which is the framework for the goals generally, has been achieved only because of the astonishing declines in poverty in China. But, for example, poverty on the African continent has gone up in absolute numbers and in percentages has gone down microscopically. So when you get one country that distorts the entire result, you've got to look at the results fairly carefully. But in terms of public policy, in terms of going to countries and saying, these are the 8 Millennium Development Goals, where do you stand on maternal mortality, where do you stand on kids in school or HIV and AIDS, they have now become obsessed with attempting to meet the goals. And that is a remarkable achievement. Well, there was a lot of the MDGs which was absolutely stupid. And that was largely because it was men who were fashioning them. So they had no sense that women constitute half the world and should be addressed as such. So, for example, the goal on women's empowerment and gender equality is measured in the terms of numbers of girls and boys in school, in primary and secondary school. Now, that's absolutely idiotic. In the whole range of issues which consume women's lives, from international sexual trafficking to child marriage, to honor killings, to economic empowerment, to property rights and inheritance rights and political representation, and sexual violence, the entire panoply of rights isn't touched within the rubric of gender equality. And that's because men drafted the particular goal. And it was senseless, and it will have to be overcome after 2015. Similarly, when the goals were drafted, there was nothing about sexual and reproductive health, which was an astonishing omission. And again, because men were primarily responsible. And it was inserted 5 years later through the back door, through HIV and AIDS, but it never got the attention it deserved. So in truth, there was a lot which was fraught with blinkered thinking within the goals themselves. In terms of the prospects for the goals, I think the greatest single lack was the work of the UN agencies. I mean, developing countries, particularly the very poor developing countries, had no capacity for indigenous resources to fulfill the goals that they thought they were subscribing to. The donor countries began drawing back from funding at precisely the critical moment. With the so-called economic downturn in 2008, the money began to dry up. But the real abysmal performance comes from the United Nations agencies. I'm tired of letting them off the hook. As you can see, it leads me to intense cerebral agitation. But the absence of the work that should have been done by UNICEF on a whole range of children's issues, from infant mortality to kids in school, the work that should have been done by UNAIDS on the vulnerability of women and other target groups to the spread of the virus, the work that should have been done by the United Nations system on climate change but was never consecrated along the route, and certainly the work that should have been done on women but which was never given a tinker's damn by the United Nations. That's where we fell down. The agencies which have, people don't know this, which have such formidable strength when it comes to dealing with the governments, simply did largely business as usual, except for the United Nations Development Program. The UNDP took it seriously. No one else, in my reference, really took it seriously. Well, If I'm honest with myself, I wasn't much around in 2000 in the Millennium Development Assembly. I had left UNICEF in 1999 and focused my work on HIV and AIDS. So I was dimly aware of the Millennium Development Assembly and the fashioning of the Millennium Development Goals, but not as aware as I might otherwise have been. I sensed two particular difficulties. One was the absence of sufficient engagement of civil society. It was still largely pro forma, canvassing amongst the really great NGOs in the world to get the sense of what they wanted. This was true of Oxfam and ActionAid and Save the Children and CARE and others, even Doctors Without Borders, which had a lot to say. They didn't have as much access as they should have to the process. It was still in the year 2000 pretty contemptuous of the roles of charitable NGOs. More recently, the NGOs are being taken seriously because it is now recognized that they had more to offer than governments had to offer. But in those days, way back in 2000 and in the period preceding it, NGOs were still persona non grata. So we lost the possibility of real intellectual power in the formulation of the goals. That was one problem. The other problem was that the alignment of reactionary states like Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Pakistan and some of the Central American states and the Vatican. God knows why they should have any say at all. Never understood that. It's preposterous. But that grouping of states is so reactionary. That's why you never got sexual and reproductive health into the goals. That's why there was tentativeness around family planning, around abortion. God forbid you should mention the name or the word. The phalanx of right-wing, reactionary, misogynistic, and often racist states made it very difficult to get some of the things into the goals that should have gone into the goals. So what happens is that the donor countries and the international financial institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, really took control of how the goals were being formulated. And I don't think we'd do that again. It's not happening this time. It's interesting to note that the three leaders who are responsible for the next set of goals contains one donor country, the United Kingdom, but also Liberia and Indonesia as part of the triad. So the world is learning that you cannot exclude the developing countries from the articulation of goals. But that's largely what happened in the year 2000.
Different altogether.
Well, for me, the difference lies in women being the benchmark. Women and girls are the benchmark of the next set of goals. It should be set out in blazing letters in the preamble to the document that emerges. This document is suffused by concern around women and girls. That's why there's sexual and reproductive health. That's why there's maternal mortality. That's why there's sexual violence. That's why gender equality is the centerpiece. That should be the way it's constructed. Now, will it extend on previous goals? Sure, because the poverty goal is nowhere near being met in most of the most seriously underdeveloped countries, particularly in Africa. The goals on HIV and AIDS were still millions and millions away from providing antiretroviral treatment for the full span of 34 million people who will need it. We've got nothing moving on climate change internationally, so that the environmental sustainability goal has to be refashioned in terms of climate change. And as far as the partnerships with donors are concerned, the donors are running in reverse all over the place and have to be confronted. So the goals on resources, the goals on gender, the goals on environment, the goals on poverty, everything that makes the world tick either have to be completely recast or extended dramatically. A very fair question about how the responsibility for implementation should be apportioned. Obviously, the individual country governments have the primary responsibility to make sure that the goals have a life in individual countries. So if you're talking about Malawi or Rwanda or Tanzania, or for that matter, India, Bangladesh, or Chile, or Paraguay, it's those individual governments which are going to have to be responsible for dealing with the goals. And civil society in those countries will have to play a fairly formidable part. But, and this just seems to me to be logical commonplace, but people are very resistant to it. The goals aren't going to work unless the donor countries start handing out the money that they have promised and betrayed. There's nowhere else to deal with this. I know that the developing countries say we want to stand on our own feet, we don't want to be dependent on the donors, and the donors say we've got a financial crisis, we don't have the money we had before. But the reality is that unless the official development assistance comes closer to the 0.7% of GDP, which was promised back in 1969, then we're never going to reach the goals in the countries where people are most vulnerable. And there's nothing wrong with showing a sign of social generosity and human decency in providing support for the implementation of the goals, which won't be implemented without it. And when you think that the official development assistance declined by 3% in 2011 and by 4% in 2012, which was a reduction of more than $10 billion. And when you think that the United States alone has already spent $2 trillion on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the recent Harvard study said it may rise to $4 to $6 trillion. And when you think of the crude sense of priorities which we embrace, which diminish the human condition always in terms of enhancing the profit position, there's no problem in meeting the resource requirements. But President Obama has just cut back on PEPFAR, the organization that supports HIV, AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria in developing countries. The Global Fund on AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria is not going to reach the goal it has, and those dollars are expanding in terms of the requirement. So I think that the goals are likely to be sabotaged in significant measure by the refusal of the donors to meet their obligations, and they have a major responsibility to bear if things don't get into place. Well, you can't, there should be mechanisms in place for accountability, but there's nothing you can do in the universe to be punitive about countries. If countries don't decide to give the money, or if they back off in certain forms of foreign aid, there's nothing you can do. You can't take Canada to court. You can't put the Prime Minister in jail. I mean, there just is no way of dealing with it. Either countries voluntarily do the work they've undertaken to do, or they don't. And the accountability is to document fully and to attempt to shame them into engagement if they are delinquent. But you can't force them into engagement because it doesn't exist. I mean, what's happened in Syria over the last many months is an indication of what happens when the world decides to hold back from a volatile and terrifying human crisis. What happened in Rwanda in 1994 when the world turned its back is indicative of the fact that you could have a genocide and no one will get engaged. And no one, but absolutely no one, is culpable. Everybody gets off the hook. At the moment, with the terrible killings in Syria on a daily basis, no one's responsible. Absolutely no one. The United States, Russia, China, all of those who are observing from France and the United Kingdom and everyone else, no one takes responsibility. So to pretend that somehow you can have accountability over the Millennium Development Goals, no, you can't. All you have is moral suasion. All you have is the urge for political leadership. All you have is shaming and naming if people don't produce. That's a hard, hard road to follow. It's painful. Well, you know, again, it depends. You can't shame Stephen Harper into anything. He's shameless, and he'll do whatever he wants to do under any circumstances, regardless of how many people he may offend. This is ideological rigidity gone berserk, and that's simply what it is. And I'm not pretending that naming and shaming the Tory cabinet in Canada is going to advance public policy in the direction of progressive instincts on the international scene. That's not going to happen. Naming and shaming in the United States is somewhat different. It wouldn't surprise me if down the road President Obama began to retreat on the use of drones. because the anxiety about the use of drones is now so great, and he has suddenly had a moment of conversion, and he wants to go back and empty Guantanamo. That's naming and shaming. That's endless New York Times editorials and being raised internationally. So you can sometimes move governments in the direction you want by naming and shaming. One of the organizations I work with most closely, AIDS Free World, we have worked very hard to name and shame Zimbabwe because of Mugabe's policy of raping women who don't support his political party. And indeed, we are trying to take the rapes that occurred in the elections of 2008 before the National Prosecuting Authority in South Africa under the jurisdiction of universal jurisdiction. So you can keep naming these countries and identifying these countries and attempting to get them to comply. But it's naming and shaming is important. I really don't think we should ever hesitate to name and shame, because it builds a kind of popular movement, and one day the pendulum swings. But no one should pretend that it will work overnight.
Name
Right.
83 must have essential features.
Well, for example, on poverty, one must recognize where the world is going. And for the first time in the history of the World Bank, 6 weeks ago, the current president of the World Bank, Jim Kim, said he was determined to see the most extreme poverty removed by the year 2030. And by extreme poverty, he means all of those living under $1.25 today, which is 1.4 billion people. Now, no president of the World Bank has ever said that before. And no president of the World Bank seems to be obsessed and seized with achieving an end to poverty at that level. Now, I may be overcompensating because I like Jim Kim and I have some faith in his sort of moral fiber. Whether he can implement it, I don't know. But it's interesting that the policy was endorsed by the World Bank set of governors, and it's never been tried before, and maybe they will now work in conjunction with the poverty MDG to see it happen. So when they come out with the new MDGs after 2015, they will say, over the next 15 years, the World Bank and individual governments must work much more closely and collaboratively together, because the bank has undertaken to do this. In the field of HIV and AIDS, which is an area I care most deeply about, treatment as prevention has become the vehicle for rescuing people who are living with the virus, and at the same time allowing a kind of swath of prevention to insulate the world from further transmission. So if we can roll out treatment, antiretroviral treatment, to the 34 million people requiring it, and the moment someone tests HIV positive, they go into treatment, and we know that that will result in prevention, because the viral load in the body is lowered to undetectable levels, and when your viral load is undetectable and you have unprotected sex, you are unlikely to transmit the virus. So treatment as prevention becomes the singular focus to handle the AIDS pandemic. And if that is part of the next set of Millennium Development Goals, that'll be quite wonderful. And if I was looking for a third, I would say sexual and reproductive health. I would say that we've got to fight the antediluvian Neanderthals who inhabit the citadels of power in Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Pakistan and beyond, and simply say to them, family planning, access to condoms, and abortion are human rights where women are concerned. And this must be embodied in the next set of goals. That'll be tough. That'll be very tough. I mean, Stephen Harper in Canada almost had a cardiac arrest when it was suggested, when he advanced his famous plan at the G8 on maternal health, when it was suggested that it should include family planning and abortion. He was astounded. But he made room because of the pressure from Hillary Clinton and others on the family planning side. Of course, they won't touch abortion. But those are things which the goals should include. There's one other area which it's difficult to know how it will be integrated, because there's so much opposition, but on the other hand, there's so much movement. One of the great human rights struggle today, indeed for my money, the only other human rights struggle that even compares marginally with the struggle for gender equality, is the struggle around lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered rights, the whole panoply of LGBT rights. and the terrible bigotry and brutality being demonstrated throughout the continent of Africa. The fact that 80 countries, 80, still criminalize homosexuality. The fact that the lesbians in South Africa are being subject to corrective rape, which is surely one of the most horrific violations that has ever been imagined. The fact that there is such a struggle for basic human rights in the LGBT arena, that too should somehow be embraced within the next set of Millennium Development Goals. And you know, I think it will be. I think it will be. On the gender equality front, it'll all be focused on sexual violence, as has already been demonstrated by William Hague, the Foreign Minister of the United Kingdom. So that's a given. But on the LGBT front, it isn't clear yet what the world is prepared to do. The features that allow global poverty to persist are a kind of conspiracy that exists internationally to prejudice the development of developing countries. So any world which still has not consecrated an international trade agreement which benefits developing countries is a world gone astray. Any world which continues to have trade agreements which celebrate agricultural subsidies for France and the United States, Canada and Australia, which prejudice the income that indigenous African countries or others would otherwise receive, that's a world out of whack. You can't continue building a world where you're looking, as we speak, looking at free trade agreements, the results of which will be to enrich pharmaceutical companies and agribusiness and multinational corporations, and the developing world be damned. You can't have that kind of conspiracy of capitalism determined to prejudice the future of poor economies and expect poverty to be overcome. So it's not merely misdirected policies in developing countries, which there are many, but you know, we have misdirected policies too, no one's immune from it. It's more that the fabric within which they work, the context within which they function is so prejudicial to their well-being. If your official development assistance goes down and you don't have monies for health or education or nutrition or agriculture, then your entire society is going to be further impoverished. It's just one of the terrifying truths that the world doesn't care much about excessive poverty and extreme poverty. I mean, we're at a population now of 6 to 7 billion, close to 7 billion, and we have over 3 billion people still living on less than $2 a day. So how in God's name can we talk about a decent, civilized international society? And the poverty is intense because the indifference and the self-serving policies of the donor world are equally intense. The opportunities for advocacy to change the current system exist around free trade agreements, as is seen now with the free trade agreement that India is about to sign with the European Union, the free trade agreements which the United States has been signing with individual countries from Jordan to Colombia, the free trade agreement that Canada wants to sign with the European Union. The advocacy around these free trade agreements, pointing out that they are largely designed to maintain high drug prices, extended patent protection, special protection for multinational corporations, special protection for agribusiness, including genetically modified organisms. All of that inherent in the free trade agreements has to be changed, and it can only be changed through advocacy. It can only be changed through these remarkable NGOs who get together and sound the alarm, and some countries start backing off and progress is made. But on the more fundamental fronts, I would think that wrapping the World Bank in a more serious way into the pursuit of ending poverty is probably the best change you can devise to deal with what was always seen to be the rationale for the Millennium Development Goals, reducing global poverty. That would seem to me to make a lot of sense. And the one other area that I would call attention to, because it encompasses so much, which would make a change, is the use of the human rights community. not simply Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, but the magnificent women's groups and others that are putting such intense pressure on governments. I mean, just think of it for a moment. There's a horrific rape in India in December, and suddenly the women of India rise up and demand an end to it. And Judge Verma, alas, a premature death, but Judge Verma drafts an astonishingly good report, which more and more the Indian legislators are feeling they have to implement because the women are putting such pressure on them. Or the American military. The American military suddenly shows a jump between 2011 and 2012 of 19,000 rapes to 26,000 rapes. And Congress goes berserk. But who goes berserk in Congress? The women of Congress. It's so interesting how women senators and women congressional people in the House of Representatives, in the last 72 hours we're doing this interview, their voices have been heard and they're not prepared to put up with it. And 3 of them head armed services committees of the 6 armed services committees. So you have an awful lot of knowledge being brought to bear which wasn't there before. I mean, if it just was up to President Obama saying, "I've got your back," which is to say to women who have suffered rape, "After the rape, I'll look after you." There's so little dealt with in preventing rape, and suddenly a group of women legislators decide to say, "We will take this seriously, and we're going to change it." In South Africa, which is considered the rape capital of the world, you have more and more intense engagement by groups, including men's groups, to deal with sexual violence. So my feeling is that all over the world you have these kernels of human rights devotion which are determined to change the landscape. And they're doing it. And it's painful and it's hard, but they never give up. And that's the secret, never to give up. I'm sure it's possible to make the language of human rights more applicable to the MDGs if you know what it means. Now let me admit something which is very, very difficult to admit. When I was at UNICEF, even before I went as a full-time employee to UNICEF, I was responsible in significant measure for getting the Convention on the Rights of the Child ratified by countries around the world. So I was bopping all over the world to persuade governments to ratify. And once we had it ratified and it was in place, and we came to the end of the 1990s and into the last decade, everybody said we must have a rights-based approach for UNICEF. And I'll tell you, I never fully understood what it meant. I mean, if it simply meant implementing the clauses of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, that's what a rights-based approach means. That's easy enough. But if a rights-based approach means a way of looking at issues, a way of characterizing or framing issues, it's much harder to find intelligible language other than rhetoric. It's so interesting. So if it's decided by the world that the next set of MDGs should be informed by a rights-based approach, which is what they'll say, then that has to be explained very carefully, because most governments haven't got the faintest idea what that means. And it's very important, therefore, to define it. Number one, that every donor country in the OECD meets 0.7% of gross domestic product as foreign aid. At the moment, the only countries who exceed it or who have reached it are Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Holland, and Luxembourg. And Holland is now retreating. So it's very uncertain whether they will reach the 0.7 next year. All of the donor countries, all of the major G8 countries have never come close to 0.7, except the United Kingdom, improbably enough under a conservative government, appears to be inching its way to 0.7. That's it seems to me, the key goal. Number two, an agricultural revolution that moves beyond South Asia and into Africa, where the most vulnerable countries exist. An agricultural revolution which Kofi Annan talks a lot about in the organizations he works with. in making sure that you have much better seeds, that you have much better fertilizer, that you have some irrigation, that it becomes possible to feed the people out of the enormous capacity for land that Africa has, and it's not now happening. And one of the interesting experiments, of course, is Jeffrey Sachs' Millennium Development Villages, which in a variety of places are doing quite well in the agricultural revolution. They're not doing so well on some other aspects, although better than most. But in agriculture, they're doing remarkably good work, and that could be a kind of symbol, a metaphor for what can happen for the continent as a whole, because if you can't feed people, then poverty will never be overcome. So on the one hand, you make sure the donor money is flowing to allow countries to maintain essentially the soft services, health, education, nutrition. The private sector will handle the infrastructure and the bridges and the roads, and China will come in and build them all and in return for loans. But the soft money through development assistance and the agricultural revolution are the two most important things. And then, for me, in any event, assuming that we are moving fairly strongly towards global public health, the key is education. There are still, depending on whom you consult, 61 million to 100 million children out of primary school who should be in primary school. And the extraordinary percentage of dropouts is quite shocking. And the absence of young girls getting into secondary school is even more shocking. And while it is a truism to say that someone, particularly a young girl who is educated, is likely to live a far more nurturing and less impoverished life, it may be a truism, but it has great impact on the ground. So on the one hand, the flow of donor money, on the other hand, an agricultural revolution to feed people, and on the third hand, an educational focus which is irreversible, and you'll begin to inch towards the eradication of global poverty. The most important contribution of the Canadian government would be to be defeated. Okay? If they lose the next election, that's their greatest contribution, because then we might be able to move into the realm of sanity in public policy as it deals with international development. For young people, the interest, I think, is to decide what is it that engages you most in these great issues, all of which impinge on poverty. Is it human rights? Is it sustainable development and climate change? Is it health or education? Is it agriculture? Is it any one of the various activities? Is it children? Is it women? Is it any one of the various activities around which young people can be engaged? You know, they can knock on the doors of NGOs and try to get a job. They can go to a developing country and work as a volunteer and then ultimately be conscripted into employment. They can maintain clubs and groups in their schools, community colleges, and universities, giving a profile to these issues. They can take them all tremendously seriously and join the activities around ASAP and global poverty. I mean, these are real things that young people can do. They can actually vote, which is sometimes useful. But I don't see any prohibition on the engagement of young people. I see a lot of young people through my own class and just when I'm at universities and community colleges who are baffled by what steps to take and where they should put their energy. And my feeling is you should always put your energy into that which you are most committed to, because all of it will ultimately lead to an end to global poverty. I mean, if you're committed to the environment, then you're dealing with climate change, which will exacerbate poverty. If you're dealing with human rights, you're dealing with the rights of women and children. And if they don't have their rights actually rooted, it will exacerbate poverty. If you're dealing with health, then obviously an ill population does not respond well to their own self-worth and self-enhancement. So wherever you focus, you will be helping to end global poverty. And if there are poverty groups as such, if there are in universities, as we know, groups of academics and students who are engaged in poverty, analyzing it, commenting on it, trying to end it, whether they volunteer at a food bank or they mount a barricade somewhere. That's what you should do. You know, every time I speak to students who have returned from Africa, they went with stars in their eyes and slightly dubious about the contribution, and they come back absolutely obsessed with the possibility of returning and making a further contribution.